Section 9 of Confessions of an English Opium Eater. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Martin Geeson. Confessions of an English Opium Eater by Thomas de Quincey. Section 9. The late Duke of used to say, "Next Friday, by the blessing of heaven, I purpose to be drunk." And in like manner I used to fix beforehand how often, within a given time, and when, I would commit a debauch of opium. This was seldom more than once in 3 weeks, for at that time I could not have ventured to call every day, as I did afterwards, for a glass of laudanum negus, warm and without sugar. No, as I have said, I seldom drank laudanum at that time more than once in 3 weeks. This was usually on a Tuesday or a Saturday night. My reason for which was this. In those days Grassini sang at the opera, and her voice was delightful to me, beyond all that I had ever heard. I know not what may be the state of the opera house now, having never been within its walls for 7 or 8 years, but at that time it was by much the most pleasant place of public resort in London for passing an evening. 5 shillings admitted one to the gallery, which was subject to far less annoyance than the pit of the theatres. The orchestra was distinguished by its sweet and melodious grandeur from all English orchestras, the composition of which, I confess, is not acceptable to my ear, from the predominance of the clangorous instruments and the absolute tyranny of the violin. The choruses were divine to hear, and when Grassini appeared in some interlude, as she often did, and poured forth her passionate soul as Andromache at the tomb of Hector, etc., I question whether any Turk, of all that ever entered the paradise of opium eaters, can have had half the pleasure I had. But indeed I honour the barbarians too much by supposing them capable of any pleasures approaching to the intellectual ones of an Englishman. For music is an intellectual or a sensual pleasure according to the temperament of him who hears it. And by the bye, with the exception of the fine extravaganza on that subject in Twelfth Night, I do not recollect more than one thing said adequately on the subject of music in all literature. It is a passage in the Religio Medici of Sir T. Brown, and though chiefly remarkable for its sublimity, has also a philosophic value, inasmuch as it points to the true theory of musical effects. The mistake of most people is to suppose that it is by the ear they communicate with music, and therefore that they are purely passive to its effects. But this is not so. It is by the reaction of the mind upon the notices of the ear, the matter coming by the senses, the form from the mind, that the pleasure is constructed, and therefore it is that people of equally good ear differ so much in this point from one another. Now opium, by greatly increasing the activity of the mind, generally increases of necessity that particular mode of its activity by which we are able to construct out of the raw material of organic sound an elaborate intellectual pleasure. But, says a friend, a succession of musical sounds is to me like a collection of Arabic characters. I can attach no ideas to them. Ideas, my good sir! There is no occasion for them. all that class of ideas which can be available in such a case has a language of representative feelings. But this is a subject foreign to my present purposes. It is sufficient to say that a chorus, etc., of elaborate harmony displayed before me, as in a piece of arras work, the whole of my past life, not as if recalled by an act of memory, but as if present and incarnated in the music, no longer painful to dwell upon, but the detail of its incidents removed or blended in some hazy abstraction, and its passions exalted, spiritualized, and sublimed. All this was to be had for 5 shillings. And over and above the music of the stage and the orchestra, I had all around me, in the intervals of the performance, the music of the Italian language talked by Italian women, for the gallery was usually crowded with Italians, and I listened with a pleasure such as that with which Weld the traveller lay and listened, in Canada, to the sweet laughter of Indian women. For the less you understand of a language, the more sensible you are to the melody or harshness of its sounds. For such a purpose, therefore, it was an advantage to me that I was a poor Italian scholar, reading it but little, and not speaking it at all, nor understanding a 10th part of what I heard spoken. These were my opera pleasures. But another pleasure I had, which, as it could be had only on a Saturday night, occasionally struggled with my love of the opera. For at that time Tuesday and Saturday were the regular opera nights. On this subject I am afraid I shall be rather obscure, but I can assure the reader not at all more so than Marinus in his life of Proclus, or many other biographers and autobiographers of fair reputation. This pleasure, I have said, was to be had only on a Saturday night. What then was Saturday night to me more than any other night? I had no labours that I rested from, no wages to receive. What needed I to care for Saturday night, more than as it was a summons to hear Grassini? True, most logical reader, what you say is unanswerable. And yet so it was and is, that whereas different men throw their feelings into different channels, and most are apt to show their interest in the concerns of the poor chiefly by sympathy, expressed in some shape or other, with their distresses and sorrows, I at that time was disposed to express my interest by sympathizing with their pleasures. The pains of poverty I had lately seen too much of, more than I wished to remember. But the pleasures of the poor, their consolations of spirit, and their reposes from bodily toil, can never become oppressive to contemplate. Now Saturday night is the season for the chief, regular, and periodic return of rest of the poor. In this point the most hostile sects unite, and acknowledge a common link of brotherhood. Almost all Christendom rests from its labours. It is a rest introductory to another rest, and divided by a whole day and 2 nights from the renewal of toil. On this account I feel always, on a Saturday night, as though I also were released from some yoke of labour, had some wages to receive, and some luxury of repose to enjoy. For the sake, therefore, of witnessing, upon as large a scale as possible, a spectacle with which my sympathy was so entire, I used often on Saturday nights, after I had taken opium, to wander forth, without much regarding the direction or the distance, to all the markets and other parts of London to which the poor resort of a Saturday night for laying out their wages. Many a family party, consisting of a man, his wife, and sometimes one or two of his children, have I listened to as they stood consulting on their ways and means, or the strength of their exchequer, or the price of household articles. Gradually I became familiar with their wishes, their difficulties, and their opinions. Sometimes there might be heard murmurs of discontent, but far oftener expressions on the countenance, or uttered in words, of patience, hope, and tranquillity. And taken generally, I must say that in this point at least, the poor are more philosophic than the rich, that they show a more ready and cheerful submission to what they consider as irremediable evils or irreparable losses. Whenever I saw occasion, or could do it without appearing to be intrusive, I joined their parties, and gave my opinion upon the matter in discussion, which, if not always judicious, was always received indulgently. If wages were a little higher, or expected to be so, or the quartern loaf a little lower, or it was reported that onions and butter were expected to fall, I was glad. Yet if the contrary were true, I drew from opium some means of consoling myself. For opium, like the bee that extracts its materials indiscriminately from roses and from the soot of chimneys, can overrule all feelings into compliance with the master key. Some of these rambles led me to great distances, for an opium eater is too happy to observe the motion of time, and sometimes in my attempts to steer homewards upon nautical principles, by fixing my eye on the pole star and seeking ambitiously for a northwest passage, instead of circumnavigating all the capes and headlands I had doubled in my outward voyage, I came suddenly upon such knotty problems of alleys, such enigmatical entries, and such sphinxes' riddles of streets without thoroughfares, as must, I conceive, baffle the audacity of porters and confound the intellects of hackney coachmen. I could almost have believed at times that I must be the first discoverer of some of these terrae incognitae, and doubted whether they had yet been laid down in the modern charts of London. For all this, however, I paid a heavy price in distant years, when the human face tyrannized over my dreams, and the perplexities of my steps in London came back and haunted my sleep with the feeling of perplexities moral and intellectual, that brought confusion to the reason, or anguish and remorse to the conscience. Thus I have shown that opium does not of necessity produce inactivity or torpor, but that, on the contrary, it often led me into markets and theatres. Yet in candour I will admit that markets and theatres are not the appropriate haunts of the opium eater when in the divinest state incident to his enjoyment. In that state crowds become an oppression to him, music even too sensual and gross. He naturally seeks solitude and silence as indispensable conditions of those trances or profoundest reveries which are the crown and consummation of what opium can do for human nature. I, whose disease it was to meditate too much and to observe too little, and who upon my first entrance at college was nearly falling into a deep melancholy, from brooding too much on the sufferings which I had witnessed in London, was sufficiently aware of the tendencies of my own thoughts to do all I could to counteract them. I was indeed like a person who, according to the old legend, had entered the cave of Trophonius, and the remedies I sought were to force myself into society, and to keep my understanding in continual activity upon matters of science. But for these remedies I should certainly have become hypochondriacally melancholy. In after years, however, when my cheerfulness was more fully re-established, I yielded to my natural inclination for a solitary life, and at that time I often fell into these reveries upon taking opium, and more than once it has happened to me on a summer night when I have been at an open window, in a room from which I could overlook the sea at a mile below me, and could command a view of the great town of L at about the same distance, that I have sate from sunset to sunrise, motionless, and without wishing to move. I shall be charged with mysticism, Behmenism, quietism, etc., but that shall not alarm me. Sir H. Vane the younger was one of our wisest men, and let my reader see if he, in his philosophical works, be half as unmystical as I am. I say then that it has often struck me that the scene itself was somewhat typical of what took place in such a reverie. The town of L represented the earth, with its sorrows and its graves left behind, yet not out of sight nor wholly forgotten. The ocean, in everlasting but gentle agitation, and brooded over by a dove-like calm, might not unfitly typify the mind and the mood which then swayed it. For it seemed to me as if then first I stood at a distance and aloof from the uproar of life, as if the tumult, the fever, and the strife were suspended, a respite granted from the secret burthens of the heart, a Sabbath of repose, a resting from human labours. Here were the hopes which blossom in the paths of life reconciled with the peace which is in the grave. Motions of the intellect as unwearied as the heavens, yet for all anxieties a halcyon calm, a tranquillity that seemed no product of inertia, but as if resulting from mighty and equal antagonisms, infinite activities, infinite repose. O just, subtle, and mighty opium, that to the hearts of poor and rich alike, for the wounds that will never heal, and for the pangs that tempt the spirit to rebel, bringest an assuaging balm. Eloquent opium, that with thy potent rhetoric stealest away the purposes of wrath, and to the guilty man for one night givest back the hopes of his youth, and hands washed pure from blood, and to the proud man a brief oblivion for wrongs undressed and insults unavenged, that summonest to the chancery of dreams, for the triumphs of suffering innocence, false witnesses, and confoundest perjury, and dost reverse the sentences of unrighteous judges. Thou buildest upon the bosom of darkness, out of the fantastic imagery of the brain, cities and temples beyond the art of Phidias and Praxiteles, beyond the splendour of Babylon and Hecatompylos, and from the anarchy of dreaming sleep callest into sunny light the faces of long buried beauties, and the blessed household countenances, cleansed from the dishonours of the grave. Thou only givest these gifts to man, and thou hast the keys of paradise, O just, subtle, and mighty opium. End of Section 9. Recording by Martin Geeson in Hazelmere, Surrey.